We have folks jumping on our web briefing this morning. We'll get started here shortly. Thanks so much. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Naina Gupta. I'm the policy director here at the Immigration Council. And just as we get started today, a reminder that our briefing is an hour long. We have an exceptional group of panelists joining us, and we will have about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation for a live Q&A. But any questions you have today on our program, as it's proceeding, you can use the Q&A function that you see in your Zoom window to enter questions. We'll be answering some as we go and others live. A reminder, our web briefings here at the American Immigration Council are recorded. We will be sending a link to the recording after today's briefing, along with resources related to the topic that we're covering around state and local police enforcing immigration law. Lastly, we cannot answer any legal questions in the Q&A or on this briefing, just as a reminder, but we're happy to answer other questions and follow up where we can. So again, I'm Naina Gupta. I'm the policy director at the American Immigration Council, and we are hosting this briefing today after 5 months of the second Trump administration and weeks now of aggressive immigration enforcement tactics in American communities around the country. From Tennessee to Florida and Texas to Nebraska, communities are witnessing unprecedented immigration enforcement actions like worksite raids, community arrests, and these are happening often at the hands of state and local police officers who are not formal federal immigration agents. As the Trump administration aims to ramp up the number of immigrants arrested each day to meet its indiscriminate quotas under its mass deportation agenda, we are seeing ICE and the Department of Homeland Security dramatically expand its workforce by partnering at a rapid pace and in an extensive manner with state and local police agencies. So in other words, police, who are typically charged with enforcing state criminal laws and protecting public safety in their communities, are simultaneously enforcing federal immigration law against people who largely pose no public safety threat. Some of these actions at the hands of state and local police have been in larger scale raids in cities like Nashville and in states like Florida and Nebraska. But we've also seen police departments make arrests through routine traffic stops or local checkpoints that result in never-ending detention, immigration proceedings, or even rapid deportation. At least 4 immigrants stopped for traffic violations ended up in the notorious mega prison in El Salvador. Several other traffic stops have made national headlines, like that of the 19-year-old young woman, Jimena Arias Cristobal, an honor roll student and track star, who was pulled over in Georgia allegedly for making a wrong turn and found herself in weeks of immigration detention and facing deportation. Other young dreamers like her, similarly heading to volleyball practice or to pick up their parents, swept up along the way by local police. As communities grasp with this new reality of mass deportation, we're talking today a bit about the policies and law behind the agreements that permit local police to enforce immigration law. I'm thrilled to be joined by Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar, who's joining us from San Antonio, Texas, Lisa Sherman Luna, Executive Director of the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, TURC, Representative Afton Bain, a Tennessee state elected representative, and our very own legal director, Michelle LaPointe. They will help us understand the ramifications these actions are having in real time on immigrants, state and elected officials, and also for the future of trust in local police. So I want to start with you, Sheriff Salazar. It would be great to hear a bit more about the community that you serve and represent as a law enforcement leader in Texas. You've been on the record pushing back on working extensively with federal immigration agencies. And if you can share with our audience why, from a law enforcement and safety perspective, you've taken that position.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me on today. I'm Sheriff Javier Salazar, Bexar County, Texas, San Antonio. We are the fourth largest county in the state of Texas, and the seventh. San Antonio is the seventh largest city in the United States. We have a population of about 2.2 million. We cover 1,200 square miles in land mass. I've got a deputy population of about just shy of 1,800 deputies, and the vast majority of those deputies work within the jail, which we have about over 5,000 inmates in the jail. I say that to say that my footprint on the patrol side of the house is decent size. There's probably about 600 or so deputies that the community will deal with out in the public eye. About half of those being on patrol side, and then the other half being courthouse and CID. I say that to say that we've got a very small footprint compared to like the San Antonio Police Department. But I do have some things that I'd like to touch on with regard to our demographics and why I think that this is not going to be a major issue for us. And I'm thankful to say that. One of the things that I believe law enforcement should strive for, especially major law enforcement agencies, is to be reflective of the community that you serve. Your demographics should match as close as possible to the demographics of the community that you serve. Now, San Antonio, Bexar County, we're at about, and of course the ranges, there's a range there, but according to the Census Bureau, we're at about 59% Hispanic population in the city of in Bexar County. The population for the sheriff's office, same demographic of Hispanic officers, we used to be at 59%. We've increased dramatically to where we're about 72% Hispanic at the sheriff's office. Now, that's not necessarily foolproof, but it certainly is very indicative of, in my opinion, very indicative of the fact that I don't believe immigration enforcement will be a large scale issue for us. Will I still have one or two here and there? Probably, but I don't think that it's a widespread issue for us. Now, recently, there's been some changes with regard to state law, and I can go into that as well. But again, looking at the programs that are available to me there, and we're still dissecting that law with the help of our DA's office, I don't think that that's going to be a major issue for us, and I'll certainly elaborate on that as well. I'm trying to touch on the bullet points that I was asked to certainly address on the onset. We were asked to address what our working history has been with DHS. We typically haven't gotten too involved with them. Now, obviously, with regard to officer safety, we're never going to let another agency get hurt. We're certainly always going to obey the law as well. But with that being said, there still has to be a line there, in my opinion, and we do maintain a line. For example, you may see some of the other law enforcement, major sheriff's offices of the state of Texas, where ICE actually has an office in the jail, a workspace in the jail. We don't have that here. If I'm not required by law to provide it, then I'm not going to provide it. Now, with that being said, I can't necessarily prevent them from coming in. So they do that on a fairly regular basis throughout the day, and they will check on people and then generate detainers. Now, again, being that our state law is what it is, we respect detainers. We comply with detainers, but with that being said, we don't go out of our way to notify ICE that we've got somebody in our custody. Again, there's going to be some changes to that with regard to the new state law, but again, we maintain a separation there wherever we can. Obviously, balancing that out with officer safety and, of course, our relationship with the community, which I believe is paramount. And again, the number one reason why I believe that there should be a separation, because we have to have that relationship with our community. We know that at this moment in our county, there are people being victimized that are more terrified of me as a uniformed law enforcement officer than they are the person committing harm on them or their children. And so we have to constantly shout from the rooftops that there is a separation there. We're not immigration enforcement. It is not a priority for us. Violent crime is a priority for us. And so, thankfully, I'm fluent in Spanish, and so I'm able to constantly get that talking point out. Things like the new law change will present some challenges, but I think that we can still stay on point with that.
That's great. Thanks, Sheriff, for that context. And you mentioned how important you believe it is to keep kind of a line between federal immigration enforcement and state and local law enforcement. And so if I can just ask one quick follow-up, can
Sure.
you say a little bit more about what you think happens or things you've seen or heard in other contexts when that line gets blurred? How, from your perspective, does it make it harder to kind of do your job or interact with community, if you don't mind saying a little bit more on that?
Well, once the community sees us all together, sees us all the same, it presents its challenges, right? That guy is dressed exactly like the ones that took my uncle away. I'm not going to call them to report A, B, or C, and I'm the sole witness to this shooting, but I don't trust them, so I'm not going to call and help in catching a shooter because I'm afraid I'm going to be deported. And so we're always making a very clear distinction that we are not immigration authorities. Call us if you are a victim or a witness to a crime. What's more, we'll help you fill out paperwork because there are still protections for victims and witnesses to a crime, U visas, things like that. And we will absolutely help them with that. But again, it's just a matter of constantly messaging that in every story that we have. Every time that I do a press conference, whether it has anything to do with immigration or not, I touch on that when I do the Spanish sound bites. I just constantly remind people of that.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful. It brings to mind, just about a month ago after raids in Tennessee that we'll talk about in a moment, there was a Tennessee sheriff who posted his concern that an immigrant non-citizen caretaker had been too scared to call 911, which had led to the death of an infant in her care, underscoring the way in which erosion of trust with local law enforcement can have these other kinds of consequences that you're alluding to. So, at the local level, what we're seeing right now, just to give a bit of context to our audience before we turn to our next speaker, is that the Trump administration is quietly lining up dozens of local police departments to help add manpower to its immigration enforcement force. So over the past 10 years, 70 to 75% of all ICE enforcement in the interior has been based on handoffs from state and local police. With a limited set of officers, ICE has around 6,000 officers. It has always relied on state and local cooperation to be its engine of enforcement. And that cooperation has taken different forms, as you've described, Sheriff Salazar. But under Trump, what we're seeing is a heavy emphasis on the 287G program, which was first authorized in 1996, which allows the government to deputize local police to actually take on certain immigration enforcement actions that a federal officer would typically do. And in exchange, the government provides some training, but no funding. So going into the Trump administration, DHS had about 135 of these 287G agreements across 16 states. But right now, ICE has over 700 of those in 40 states, an over 400% increase in just 5 months. And half of these partnerships, notably signed under President Trump, specifically use a model of this program called the task force model that was discontinued in 2012, but that is being resurrected. And that actually allows police officers to take on a much broader range of immigration actions during routine police activity. So everything from interrogating somebody about their citizenship status to detaining them, to putting them into removal proceedings. And through this sort of 400% increase of these agreements, in just 5 months, DHS has doubled its workforce by working with state and local agencies. And so, Lisa, I want to turn to you next. Lisa, again, is the executive director at the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. And just, a few weeks ago, the city of Nashville, Tennessee, immigrant communities there faced an ongoing set of immigration raids. And as I understand it, those were conducted both by federal officers, but also by Tennessee State Patrol officers. So Lisa, amidst this context of proliferation of these agreements and what you saw happen in Nashville, can you just share with folks a little bit more about, what happened with these raids, what you saw for communities on the ground, and what the fallout has been since then.
Yes, and thank you so much for joining everybody on the call this morning, and to the American Immigration Council and our own representative Afton Bain for being here today. In the early hours of May 5th, 2025, advocates and organizers in Nashville began receiving calls about people being picked up at traffic stops in South Nashville, which is the heart of the immigrant and refugee community in our city. A lot of people may not think of Tennessee as being incredibly diverse, but our demographics have rapidly grown over the past few decades. So 140 languages are spoken in Nashville public schools. As we spoke to eyewitnesses and family members of those who disappeared, it quickly became clear that this was a coordinated operation between the Tennessee Highway Patrol and the Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, agents, to stop and arrest community members driving in our most diverse neighborhoods. As Turk, a statewide immigrant and refugee rights coalition that is membership-based, that is almost 25 years old, we had been preparing since last year for mass worksite raids and increased efforts to ramp up deportations through our criminal legal system. But nothing had prepared us for this type of dragnet operation on the streets. In my decades-long career in human rights and in immigration, I'd never seen or experienced anything so blatantly discriminatory and brazen by law enforcement at this scale. By the end of the almost 10-day operation, the Tennessee Highway Patrol said it conducted about 600 traffic stops, with ICE confirming it had arrested about 200 individuals from these stops. As Turk, we received or made more than 2,000 calls to try and identify those that were missing, provide resources, or make referrals. Our staff were working around the clock, training up new volunteers and doing the tedious work of trying to track people down, while ICE was moving people around the country with zero transparency or accountability. The level of humanitarian need generated by these actions is overwhelming. People were losing breadwinners in their family, children were being left behind. An enormous amount of local resources went to respond to the immediate needs of those impacted, but also the wider fear and panic in the community. I want to be very clear. This was akin to responding to a mass casualty event or a natural disaster, but one where medical providers are being obstructed from accessing their patients and their patients' medical history, with the federal government actively precluding us from obtaining information that could save lives. It's unconscionable. Despite the press statements from both the Tennessee Highway Patrol and ICE, we still have not received a full list of everyone who was arrested and detained. The only names we have, about 100, are a result of grassroots efforts to identify those who went missing. Together with 4 other legal service organizations, we sent ICE a letter asking for the names and aid numbers of individuals detained in these sweeps, explaining that we're prepared to offer legal counsel and expecting access to our clients. But to this day, we have not received any information about the remaining 100 people. Despite the rhetoric of this being a public safety operation, of the nearly 200 people that were arrested and detained, ICE only disclosed convictions involving 6 individuals, which we know we can't even trust this information because we know that they lie. ICE, of course, started a predictable smear campaign to paint our communities with a wide brush, but what we actually heard were stories of a father being picked up while buying birthday decorations for his son's birthday, and the mother having to spend the whole next day looking for her husband instead of celebrating her 7-year-old. A chef and a mother who has U.S. citizen kids who's lived here for 30 years, who was followed by ICE into her house and arrested while coming home from work in downtown Nashville. Young men who came to this country to seek opportunity being asked if they had tattoos in order to fit the profile of the Trump administration. And a longtime church leader in the local community ripped from his family. These are the real stories of this type of indiscriminate enforcement activity. But this didn't happen by accident. Tennessee Highway Patrol made a plan to prowl neighborhoods where they could stop people based on the color of their skin for supposed traffic violations. But instead of citing them under any state law, they immediately turned individuals over to ICE to be stripped from our communities within hours. This type of operation should terrify every American who cares about due process or the rule of law. These types of operations have ripple effects, not just on the families and the individuals, but across our community. Community members were scared to go to work, to school, or even the grocery store. Local big businesses were struggling to keep their doors open. Some even had to shutter permanently without workers, and kids were missing from schools. People were canceling critical appointments to the doctor, and our whole community was preoccupied with supporting our neighbors. Teachers, doctors, restaurant workers, even a local pet store was reaching out to offer help or ask questions about how they could protect their workers, their friends, their clients, or their students. What's unique in a place like Tennessee is the limit on localities to respond to the needs of their constituents due to extreme state overreach. We have an extreme Republican supermajority in our state, and they have really prevented our local government from doing things to protect the interest of their constituents. The Tennessee Highway Patrol said that it was targeting a Nashville neighborhood that was known for car accidents and gang activity. But if that was the case, why did they not involve local law enforcement or coordinate with Nashville government on ways to improve public safety in a way that met the needs of the local community? As you heard from the sheriff, local police, schools, and other agencies don't want this type of enforcement activity in their communities. It distracts from their real work and it creates new challenges in serving the public. Nana mentioned earlier the chief of police in Laverne, who had to have a town hall to try and calm down the community and reassure them after a mother lost her child because she was terrified to call 911. This really distracts from the work of local law enforcement and meeting the real needs in their communities. Ironically, the day that the operation ended, the Tennessee Highway Patrol signed a 287G agreement, which deputizes state officers as ICE agents. And to give you some perspective, in January 2025, Tennessee had only 2 counties with 287G. That was Knox County and Greene County out in East Tennessee. But just in the last 6 months, we have over a dozen counties who have signed up for 287G, including the Tennessee Highway Patrol and the Tennessee Department of Corrections. The infrastructure that has been created in the last 6 months with Tennessee taxpayer resources and our federal dollars will take a generation to undo. And it's going to result in the forcible removal of thousands who call Tennessee home, separating families, devastating our economy, and diverting critical resources from the real needs of Tennesseans. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that really evocative description of what you've been dealing with in Tennessee coming out of this, and also just for helping us understand some of the politics and nuts and bolts of the agreements you're seeing in Tennessee. And, you mentioned that just after this raid, the Highway Patrol in Tennessee entered into a 287G agreement, which underscores that, traditionally in the past, 287G agreements have been voluntary. DHS wants to enter into them, but state and local law enforcement agencies make a choice as to whether or not they want to enforce in this way. But recently, as you're alluding to, we've seen a wave of legislation in state legislatures that require sheriffs or local police departments to work with the federal government on immigration enforcement. So here at the council, we are tracking 177 bills across the country in various state legislatures that contains some provision outlining direct cooperation with federal authorities or that prohibit sheriffs and leaders like Sheriff Salazar from drawing the kinds of lines that he's described. And of the bills we're tracking, I think 14 now have passed that require localities to cooperate in this way. And so I want to turn now to you, Representative Bain. You are an elected official in the Tennessee State Legislature, but you've been vocal in protecting immigrant communities from these kinds of enforcement actions in what sounds like an otherwise politically supportive context for Trump's mass deportation agenda. So, if you could share with us what actions you're seeing specifically in the Tennessee legislature to support this current enforcement agenda and your sort of reactions, thoughts, and actions in response to this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think the context is really important. So in January in Tennessee, our governor decided to call a special session, which tethered school vouchers to Hurricane Helene relief and a sweeping immigration bill. This immigration bill included $20 million to incentivize local law enforcement to collaborate with federal ICE officials in 287G agreements. It also created a centralized immigration enforcement division and a chief immigration czar appointed by the governor, making us the only non-border state with an immigration czar who just so happens to be a former ICE agent. It also created a new state-issued driver's license that distinguishes U.S. citizens from legal permanent residents. And finally, made it a felony for local officials to adopt or maintain a sanctuary city policy. Just so happens the legislature outlawed sanctuary city policies, but that doesn't make it any less more lethal. In the law, they included making it a Class E felony and the possibility of 1 to 6 years of imprisonment for law officials, local officials to adopt, enact, or even vote on policies that conflict with state interests. Yesterday, ACLU filed a lawsuit on their behalf, and I'll drop that link in the chat. So fast forward to the end of April, and I was out in the most Hispanic part of my district, canvassing, knocking doors, conducting a community needs assessment. And in that assessment, the top 2 concerns were over 70% of respondents said racial profiling, and over 70% of the respondents said, we believe our local electeds aren't doing enough to protect us. So I took that as a mandate. Following the first week of the ICE operation, which Lisa alluded to, our mayor, Freddie O'Connell, promoted a massive fund from private donors that ran through our community foundation. He also reissued an executive order that any request from ICE needed to be directly promoted up the chain to the mayor's office. And so, you know, these innocuous actions, right? I also went out on ICE Watch in my district. I was pulled over by the Tennessee Highway Patrol and cited for allegedly running a red light. Following the operation, our congressman, Representative Andy Ogles, called for the arrest of our mayor, Freddie O'Connell, called for the arrest of a local immigrant elected official, and then called for my arrest, and elevated the call so high that the Department of Homeland Security retweeted the video that he tweeted of me. I had to find a federal criminal defense attorney, and a few weeks ago, I was almost abducted from our legislative office in Nashville. So it's now June. With regard to our mayor, his office has received 2 congressional letters from Representative Andy Ogles, along with our obvious death threats that we receive on a daily basis. The Speaker of the House filed a bill that would make it a Class E felony for any state or local official to negligently release information that identifies officers tasked with immigration enforcement and paves the way to oust those who violate the law, expands the provisions under the Tennessee Public Records Act to protect undercover officers and sensitive information and activity. The state also responded with obviously masking the current identities of ICE agents and denying any public requests that were in the pipeline. This is the biggest issue for me. Our Democratic caucus chairman, who also happens to be an attorney, sent a letter to the Highway Patrol asking for information about this raid, to which they responded, "We will not be answering any further questions." The authoritarian capture of Tennessee is a warning to all of you, a glimpse into the climate of impunity and absolute opacity, where it's nearly impossible for local communities, advocates to obtain basic information about enforcement activity. It's a state where elected leaders risk arrest or worse from defending their immigrant constituents. This is the reality that we're fighting, and it can take root anywhere if we don't stand up to it now.
Thanks so much, Representative Vane, for sharing all of that and for joining us, given the threats and targeting that you're facing in real time right now. There's a lot that you've shared, both in terms of the retaliation against you and other state leaders in Tennessee, and also what it sounds like is a temperature check from communities and law enforcement leaders in your state who have hesitations about these agreements. And you mentioned, public safety, racial profiling, studies by academics and nonpartisan organizations including also the government itself, in several Department of Justice investigations from the past, have shown that 287G agreements do not lower crime and increase discriminatory practices in police departments like racial profiling. In practical terms, of course, when state law enforcement officers or local police officers are trying to identify people who are in violation of immigration law, that is not obvious by looking at somebody. And so race is used as an obvious proxy to try to determine who might be folks to sweep in when they're enforcing. And that has led to the kind of excessive racial profiling we've seen. We also know that while ICE does train police officers to a small extent under these agreements, the cost of the enforcement work itself falls on police departments and agencies and localities. I want to turn to our legal director, Michelle Lapointe, here at the council. And Michelle, there are a few things that would be helpful to have you unpack for us. One is that when state and local police are enforcing in the ways that we've heard today, like with the Tennessee Highway Patrol, what are the legal limits they're subject to under the Constitution or the Immigration and Nationality Act, in the way that they interact with community as they enforce these laws? And what are some other legal authorities outside of 287G that we've seen local agencies, or rather the Trump administration, invoke to work with local agencies? And anything else you can provide, especially as we've heard terms thrown around today, like detainers, and other aspects of collaboration.
Yeah, thank you, Nana, and thanks everyone for joining us today, especially to our friends in Tennessee and Texas who are doing this kind of work to protect communities against immigration overreach in very hostile climates. We hear a lot about Los Angeles and all the wonderful organizing going on there, but it's just really inspiring to hear about people doing the work in states that are not very friendly to immigrants as a general matter. And in communities that are incredibly diverse and sometimes don't get recognized as such. So thank you to all our friends in Tennessee and Texas. So yes, there are legal limits on what state and local police officers can do in terms of immigration law. As a general matter, state and local law enforcement does not have the authority to arrest and detain people for violations of civil immigration law. And this is a really important thing to recognize. Generally speaking, being in the United States without authorization, without immigration papers, is a civil offense. It is not a criminal offense. And that's important for the purposes of state and local law enforcement's authority, because typically law enforcement officers need probable cause to believe that someone is committing a crime, is involved in criminal activity to effectuate an arrest. And they need reasonable suspicion to briefly detain someone for suspected criminal violations. And again, civil immigration offenses, civil immigration violations are not criminal activity for the most part. So state and local law enforcement cannot just go wandering randomly in the streets or on the highways looking for people to round up for immigration violations. Now, 287G is a limited exception to this prohibition, but it is limited because it is, first of all, requires a written agreement with the state or local law enforcement agency outlining precisely what duties the state or local law enforcement officers are going to carry out on behalf of ICE or DHS. And it is supposed to require, it does require, training of these specific delegated officers to understand immigration law and how to carry it out. Immigration law is incredibly complex, as Nana alluded to. You cannot just look at someone and determine whether they're in the country unlawfully. And even once you start digging into someone's immigration status, it can be very complicated. People may have entered unlawfully, but are here seeking or perhaps have received authorization to remain. And that means they probably can't be arrested or detained under the immigration laws if they have some level of protection. Now, all of that is in flux, of course, with this administration. the new procedures that they're implementing to sweep up more people into immigration arrest and detention. But just sort of zooming out, this is not something that a local cop on the street can understand or should be legally permitted to carry out. However, one of the primary tools that ICE uses to work with state and local law enforcement across multiple presidential administrations is what's called an immigration detainer. And this was mentioned earlier in the call. We got some questions about what this is, so I want to pause for a minute and talk about what detainers are. Detainers are used by ICE and other DHS officials when they identify a potentially deportable individual who's being held in a local jail or state prison. And a detainer is a document, basically. It's issued by an authorized immigration official, and it is a request to the local law enforcement officer to hold an individual for up to 48 business hours beyond the time when they would otherwise have been released under the state criminal charge. For example, when the charges are dropped, or if the person is acquitted, or if they've gotten bail, or if a convicted individual has served their sentence. Generally speaking, they should be released at that point. If an ICE detainer is lodged, that is a request that the state or local official hold that person for 48 hours, excluding weekends and holidays, so that ICE can essentially come and pick them up and then funnel them into immigration detention. But it's really important to remember that this is just a request. Of course, in some states, the state legislatures have purported to make compliance with immigration detainers mandatory, so that there are exceptions to this, but under state law. But for the most part, a local law enforcement agency has the discretion to decide whether to honor a detainer or not, and under what circumstances. To issue a detainer, ICE is supposed to have probable cause that the individual is deportable. So that means, for example, the person has a final order of removal or is in removal proceedings or other evidence. But the presence of a detainer alone does not say anything specific about the individual's immigration status. And it is not, the detainer itself is not initiating removal proceedings or deportation. It's really important to remember, actually, that localities that have honored ICE detainers have faced litigation and costly settlements. One of the issues is that the databases that ICE uses to issue detainers are riddled with error. This has resulted in people being issued detainers who have lawful status and even US citizens. And there is a Fourth Amendment problem, a constitutional problem, when localities hold people for more than 48 hours after they would have otherwise been released. Some courts have even found that just honoring the detainer at all creates a Fourth Amendment constitutional problem, because, again, to arrest someone, to hold someone in that way, generally you need probable cause of a crime. And that's not what a detainer says. It's simply a request from ICE. So we've seen Los Angeles County, it has paid out a $14 million settlement, a settlement that was reached in 2020 for a class of individuals who were held by the county pursuant to ICE detainers. New York City also recently settled a $92.5 million settlement in an immigration detainer case. And then separately, we've seen challenges to 287G agreements as well. Just this week, the New York Civil Liberties Union, Latino Justice, and others filed a challenge to Nassau County, New York's 287G agreement in state court in New York. Now, beyond 287G, there is another sort of new, it's actually been around for a while, but no one has ever invoked it, a new source of authority under the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, that this administration is using to again ramp up state and local law enforcement cooperation with ICE. And this is called the Mass Influx Declaration. This comes out of a 1996 law that Congress passed that gives the federal government the power to declare an emergency relating to a mass influx of migrants. And again, this has never been used until now. And with this declaration, the government can delegate authority to local law enforcement in certain areas to enforce some aspects of federal immigration law. On January 23rd of this year, the law was invoked for the first time, and the administration declared a mass influx affecting the entire United States, saying in all 50 states there's this imminent emergency, and therefore DHS could deputize local law enforcement to conduct immigration enforcement. Now, it still requires an agreement. They can't force this on localities who don't want to be involved. And so far, we've only seen the Texas National Guard enter into one of these agreements with Border Patrol, with CBP. And like 287G, mass influx declarations require a written agreement with the locality, but unlike 287G, the training requirement can be waived under this provision. So it's potentially even more dangerous in terms of empowering state and local law enforcement to make immigration determinations. But I think the boundaries of it have not yet been tested, and we'll have to see what happens. And finally, just wanted to mention that agreement has been, or that declaration has been renewed on March 25th for a period of 180 days. So we could potentially see more willing state and local law enforcement agencies enter into agreements with the feds. And finally, I just wanted to touch on some of the state laws that have been enacted recently that also are going to sort of supercharge enforcement, or are trying to. States around the country have enacted laws that purport to give immigration powers to state and local officials directly. The first, in recent years, the first one we saw was in Texas in 2023 with SB 4. That's been blocked by the courts. That would have created criminal state law penalties for entering the state as an undocumented immigrant or after having been removed. Now, there's already a federal law that covers this. And the states are attempting to do this, even though the Supreme Court said in the Arizona versus United States case in 2012 that these types of laws are preempted, which means they're unconstitutional because only the federal government can regulate immigration in this way. But that hasn't stopped other states from trying. Florida passed a law this year, SB 4C, attempting to do the same thing. Iowa in 2024, in a case, we've challenged this law under preemption principles as well, and it's currently being blocked by the courts. And then we saw in Tennessee, in addition to the laws that Representative Bain mentioned, the legislature also passed a new law that would criminalize harboring undocumented immigrants in the state of Tennessee, and harboring is defined as including the provision of shelter to undocumented immigrants if there is a financial component involved, which we think includes donations and any kind of exchange of money. For example, a landlord who is renting to a person that they know or suspect to be undocumented could be at risk of prosecution under this law. And just last week, we filed a challenge to this with TIRC, Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, and ICAP, the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. So as I said, the courts have struck down these laws as preempted, but the states are aggressively kind of pursuing the boundaries of that decision, and we'll see what happens. And I will pause there.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That was very helpful to unpack a lot of different pieces of this. And just for folks who are still on with us, there will be a round of resources we share after this around this mass influx legal authority Michelle is referencing, around detainers and detainer practices, and other articles that have posted on this recent wave of state bills criminalizing various kinds of activity in immigrant communities. So we have a lot of excellent questions for our speakers. So I want to dive right into our Q&A. And I'm going to start with a question where maybe we can just get a short response from both Lisa and Representative Bain. One of our participants mentioned that in the state of Florida, the state legislature has recently put forward a huge amount of money towards supporting immigration enforcement, and asked, like, what efforts can communities and stakeholders and other states make to push back on the diversion of state resources toward the federal government's immigration agenda. And I wondered if both of you as leaders in Tennessee could speak to that, and then I can turn to Sheriff Salazar with some questions.
Absolutely. What we know from years of research, narrative research, and polling, and just being on the ground, talking to communities is that you have to appeal to people's self-interest. And so pushing back on the use of taxpayer resources, especially in a place like Tennessee, where we are at the bottom in so many determinants of well-being, whether it's healthcare, access to good quality public schools, good paying jobs. It's so important to have narrative strategies and be storytelling in a way that appeals to people's self-interest and that they can understand how diverting resources like this impacts their daily life, whether they're an immigrant or not. And I think Representative Bain has been doing an amazing job with that in a place like Tennessee, where there is very few opportunities to pass really progressive policies that benefit working class people. It's important to have marker bills or bills that really change and shape the narrative and help people understand the work that government should be doing for you. And so I'll let her talk about specifically her grocery tax bill, which has been so successful. Republicans have introduced their own version of the bill because she successfully pushed the narrative in the direction of Tennesseans clamoring for relief from grocery taxes.
Yeah, from a narrative perspective, the onslaught and deluge of aggressive emails and voicemails I've received is that immigrants are not the reason your grocery prices are high. I'm sorry you're struggling, but that is not the reason that you are struggling. And it seems to kind of be a biting rebuttal in which they don't respond. But from an organizing perspective, I think this is a really important moment. We are about to face massive austerity. Every state is cutting their income tax. They are cutting budgets left and right. In addition to your states reconvening in August and the fall to look at the agency budgets and the impact of this bill moving federally, we are about to see the decimation of programs. And so I think this provides an opportunity to show where are our priorities? Why are we breaking up families? Most Americans want federal immigration reform, but they did not sign up for mass deportations and using taxpayer dollars to do that. And so I would really look to link this issue to your state budget and austerity fights that are most likely imminent in the next few years.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much to both of you. I want to turn to you, Sheriff. There are several questions that have come in, so I want to tee up two in particular. One from somebody who's asking, do you have a feeling, or can you share from your perspective how police unions and trooper unions feel about 287G agreements that we've talked about here, but particularly in terms of the extra workload that gets placed upon their members? And maybe you can say more about what it means to use resources to enforce immigration law and what that takes resources away from, and where unions stand on that. And then a sort of parallel to that, there is somebody sort of seeking clarification on whether your police department at the current time is in a 287G agreement.
Okay, I can hit both of those to the extent possible, right? With regard to unions, I'm not a union member. I was during my previous part of my career where I was a San Antonio police officer for 24 years, but I'm no longer a member of a union. I can tell you just from what I've seen, I actually don't. I think the unions are pretty supportive of the Republican agenda. Unfortunately, because the Republican agenda is no friend to police unions, I can tell you that, unions in general. But from what I've seen, they're pretty supportive of the Republican agenda and talking points. And I think that they're more supporters of that than they are worried about workload being creative, just from what I've seen. Okay, haven't really heard any big speaking out against this, even though, in my opinion, this will create an undue burden on local law enforcement. Whether they see it or not at this point, I think that it's going to create that, although we're trying to mitigate that. The other question was, do we currently have a 287G? Does the Bexar County Sheriff's Office currently have a 287G? The answer is no. Recently, I was asked again before the passage of this law if I would voluntarily agree to come in, and my answer was no. And much to the chagrin of Tom Homan, and I'm going to be honest, I haven't lost a whole lot of sleep over Tom Homan's opinions of me or of how I do business. So that's fine. And we don't intend to voluntarily, join. Now, obviously, this law just was signed into effect yesterday, and we're still looking at we're dissecting that law with the DA's office and looking at what exactly does it mean. From what it looks like now for us, we have through December of 2026 to request an agreement with ICE. Now, I can certainly see us taking that at least that long to enter into an agreement. I'm not in any major hurry to do it. Going to comply with the law, but again, I'm not going to jump through any flaming hoops to get it done anytime soon. With that being said, my understanding, as I understand it now, it looks like we have an option of which model we'd like to join. The three models being the jail model, the warrant service officer model, which is also it's exclusively in the jail, and the task force model, which has law enforcement officers. Here at the sheriff's office, we have two sides of the house. We have the detention side, as I mentioned, which is where the bulk of my deputies work. And then we have the law enforcement side of the house. So I make that distinction between the two sides of the house for us. They're all deputies. They all look alike, but their areas of responsibility are different, even though their uniforms are the same. So with that being said, of those three models, the one that appeals to me the most, at this point anyway, seems to be the warrant service officer model. That entails deputies in the jail being able to ask certain questions that as of before this law, we really didn't have the authority to even ask, but now we will. My understanding of that, the reason that I prefer that model is, of course, I want to keep my law enforcement side of the house non-immigration enforcement related to the extent that we can, right? I'm not allowed to, by another state law that was passed several years ago, I'm not allowed to prohibit that from saying that. But they're so busy out there that I just don't think that it's a priority for them. So with that being said, the warrant service model allows us, as far as I can see, to keep the law enforcement side of the house free from immigration burdens. It concentrates only on the jail population side. And as I understand it, again, if I only put one deputy through that 8-hour course for the warrant service model, then that satisfies my requirement under the law. So if it only requires one, I can't see that I'm going to be in a hurry to put 2, 3, or 400 through that model. I'm going to comply with the law, but just to the extent that I absolutely have to.
Thanks so much, Sheriff. That's really helpful. I want to pull out a few things. I mean, what you're describing here is sort of this balance of following a state law that requires you to get into these agreements, but doing so in a way that is as protective of your communities as possible. And as I've talked to sheriffs and other law enforcement officials around the country, many are in a similar position. And I also appreciate you mentioning the three models of the 287G program. We talked today specifically about the task force model. Again, the other two versions of this were in effect before the Trump administration, where state and local police officers in jails, state and county jails, are enforcing immigration law in smaller degree. But what we're seeing now is that more excessive kind of immigration enforcement and at large in our communities when it becomes more visible to us as we see this sort of targeted toward neighbors and people we know. So appreciate that. We're going to do two last questions here. First to Michelle. There have been a couple of questions asking about, as advocates, is there anything we can do for people who are subject to an immigration detainer, which again is not a judicial warrant, and for folks who are being swept up who have no criminal record?
Yeah, I mean, for years, advocates have been, and across administrations, advocates have been filing challenges, essentially habeas petitions, when localities are holding someone on detainers past the time when they should have been released. And this, again, is something that localities should keep in mind when they're honoring detainers, that they could face both liability on the monetary damages side in the cases that I talked about, but also just have to defend against habeas corpus petitions that lawyers can submit. And there have been successes where people get into court quickly and get a court to recognize that the local jail does not have any authority to hold a person beyond the time that they would have been released. And folks have been let go because ICE has limited resources and can't always get to people in the timeline that they would want to. So that's why it's really important if you hear about someone who's being held past this time and you're able to get in touch with an attorney to file, it has to happen very rapidly, obviously, but in some cases it can be successful.
Thanks, Michelle, for that realistic perspective on what we can do for individual people in our communities. So just to wrap us up, Representative Bain and Lisa, maybe we can give you a few last words here, and then I'll offer some closing thoughts. But, you know, we're getting a lot of questions, understandably, from folks who are on what they can do to push back on this. And, you know, you are both in a state where you are facing, you know, a mixed bag in terms of like some who support and some who don't. Others on our call today are in states that are more opposed to this kind of collaboration. But from where you're sitting, what can folks be doing to push back on this kind of collaboration and the harmful impacts you've described from it?
Thank you. Happy to take that question first. Getting involved locally. There are so many organizations at the local level who are supporting families who are impacted, whether it's through community organizing and storytelling and narrative shaping or mutual aid groups. Groups like Turk that are also building up their legal arms. And so getting involved with a local organization, especially in a state like Tennessee, organizations that understand that this is a long-term fight. As I said earlier, dismantling 287G is going to be a generational fight. And so everything that we do, we look at it from a long-term power building lens, and how are we using every opportunity to bring people into our movement, give them opportunities to plug in, to volunteer. And we have elections next year. There's going to be a special election in Tennessee probably this year, as well as elections next year. And so channeling people's outrage and anger into hitting the ballot box, canvassing, talking to your neighbors, registering voters, ensuring that people understand how these issues impact their daily life, whether they're immigrant or not, and demanding that our government meet the real needs of people in our communities.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think what's been revelatory in this experience is that I'm one of a few elected officials in this country that probably have the pedigree and skill set to organize through authoritarian capture. And a lot of our elected officials at the state and local level, they didn't sign up for this. They signed up to repair potholes. They signed up to, you know, fight for a new housing facility for low-income seniors in their district. They did not sign up to fight fascism. And for you all on this call that want to make it incentivizing for local electeds to stand with you, right? We have the moral argument, but unfortunately in states like Tennessee, people are scared. I am planning to go to jail by the end of this year or be killed. I mean, it is the reality in the state. And for you all, challenging the want to maybe cancel elected officials if they are not with you, right? We have to do a lot of work right now in pulling the Overton window closer to us, right? And to show that the issue of immigration is not going away, and that in states like Tennessee, you have to dive headfirst into it. You can't ignore it. It is not going away. And in fact, the more that you double down on the community and in-care narrative around what makes Tennessee and your communities great is the antidote to what is happening. So in that regard, please continue to inform your local electeds, onboard them, keep them close, help them co-govern with you. And I'm grateful to Turk because Lisa and I have been on the phone probably 5 times a day since January. And the most rewarding part of my job right now is this moment and with you all. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And, you know, you've both, as well with Sheriff Salazar, have hit so well what has to happen at the local level and the state level. And I'll just add that, you know, here in Washington, D.C. in Congress, there is a bill called the PROTECT Act, which seeks to end the 287G program and make significant amendments to it to scale back the harms that have been well documented across the spectrum of this program. And so encouraging folks also to, you know, follow along with the council as we share more about that bill and other monitoring that we're doing of state legislation across the country. Our recording of today's briefing will be sent with resources. And so I just want to offer, to quote one of our participants in closing, thank you, Sheriff Salazar, Representative Bain, and Lisa Turk for your courage in standing up in places that are hostile to your positions, and for the immigrant community. Thank you again for joining us, and for all who stayed on for our hour. Take care.